Thank you for joining us tonight for our RiverWatch Fall Speaker Series. For those of you who are not familiar with the Illinois RiverWatch Network, RiverWatch is a community science organization that trains volunteers to monitor water quality in their own communities. The mission of RiverWatch is to safeguard the future of Illinois rivers and streams through stewardship, education, and sound science. Before we get started, I ask that you keep your microphone muted during the presentation to limit the distractions. We will have a Q&A session after the presentation. So if you have a question along the way, you can either put it in the chat box to be answered at the end, or you can save the question and ask it aloud. And with that, I would like to welcome Phil Nicodemus. Phil has worked for the Illinois Natural History Survey, Chicago Botanic Garden, and Shed Aquarium, and he has a passion for pushing to make cities and suburbs more hospitable for native plants and wildlife, and helping create connections between wild spaces and communities. Phil has been leading the research efforts at Urban Rivers since 2015, where he is investigating the role floating wetlands and other artificially built habitat structures can play in supporting river ecology in urban environments. And with that, I'd like to welcome Phil.
Hello, can you all hear me all right?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate the intro. Let me just make sure that this next part is going. No, I'm sharing that. Great. And we're going to go from the beginning. Oops, too many slides. Okay. Everybody see that? Does that look good? Great. All right. So as Hannah mentioned, I am Phil Nicodemus. I'm our research director with Urban Rivers. Our office is normally not this dark and dungeness, so hopefully you bear with me there. But everything else, bright, sunny day out after the rain outside today. Great example of some of the things that rivers tend to go through in urbanized systems. We've been working to build the Wild Mile, which is a concept that is turning an old industrial canal in Chicago River into a wildlife-focused park. A lot of park spaces exist throughout Chicago are not necessarily oriented towards wildlife. And even if they are, they're not also necessarily oriented towards getting people to see that wildlife once they set it up. So we're really trying to thread the needle here and develop a couple of cool little projects across the river system, started with our main flagship, the Wild Mile. So our whole thought process here is rethinking what a river can be in the urban context. This picture here is a pretty good, if you look past the text, a pretty good example of what a lot of Chicago's river edges look like, but also urbanized waterways throughout the world. A lot of these cities founded on rivers because they meant a lot to human civilization throughout time. A lot of need for transport, for defense, for fresh water, for all kinds of agricultural needs and things like that. Really hard to undersell how important rivers are to human civilization and human cities in particular. So we kind of really had this big wave of cities that are established along rivers in these really unique ecosystems where rivers interface with larger bodies of water tends to be right where we put cities. And so naturally, the things that we did to them following that can be incredibly consequential to ecosystems upstream and downstream. And that's something that we're hoping to reverse as we've got this opportunity to take these old industrial areas that are no longer used for the purpose they were built for, trying to make it such that we're not just entering into a new situation where it's just more concrete, it's just more steel edge, equally inhospitable to wildlife. We have a really great opportunity to lean into the more naturalized aspects of what we can do in these urbanized waterways. So big questions here are, how do you reconnect these three separated areas in cities? We've got people who live here. We've got the natural environment that we've built this city to keep away from us. And then we've got our stuff that we put here in its place. So how do we understand and work within the context of the built environment to reinvite the natural world and reconnect Chicago's residents to that natural world? Rivers are a great place to start. They're natural corridors for ecosystems, they're natural corridors for wildlife. Chicago has a dubious distinction of being a flyway that is perhaps one of the most deadly cities in the world for bird strikes and things like this. And this is stuff that is only a problem because we as a community, we as a city haven't really thought about and haven't really been executing the best ways to carry these ecosystems, to carry this wildlife through the city. We've kind of set up this entire urban environment to block these things out. Cook County Forest Preserve system has a lot of great forest preserves. The North Branch of Chicago River going north has a lot of really probably half-mile thick forest preserve and hardwood forest on either side of the river. There are great areas that can really well supported by resources and by volunteer work. So the question is, how do you begin to bring that down into the city, and how do you take this opportunity and turn it into something that is as ecologically valuable as we can get? Chicago, long history of having really roughly treated its river edge. If you take a look at this picture, I think this is Rush Street back in the 1900s or so. And if you'll look really closely, one thing you'll notice is there are no plants anywhere. The native plant species that we've come to expect upon these river edges were never really given a chance to survive in this world that we built up. In fact, those very plant species, in some cases, were the things that were going to hamper industry and commerce and trade. We needed all that space just to load things onto boats. And then everything else that's tried to survive since then has got to fit within this box, big, dirty, polluted, disgusting box. Over the years, this situation has changed a lot, though. A lot of everyone kind of the very start of, I guess, restoration happens in the 70s, 1970 Clean Air, Clean Water Act, 70-72. These things are sort of the change in winds, the shift in direction for a lot of especially urban waterways where pollution and dumping was rampant. There's now legal recourse to prevent this kind of thing. And as a consequence, the water quality would improve over the decades, and federal government, especially City of Chicago, federal government, MWRD, Water Reclamation District, they would have been putting billions of dollars into cleaning up these water resources. But the one thing that really doesn't get touched a whole lot is this river edge development. So even as water improves, you're still missing this key piece to not only rebuilding these ecosystems, but also helping people understand why we're doing this and what we're doing and making them a part of it too. It's another key piece. As you can see, people are also kept away from the river in this picture. They get to walk over it, they get to boat over it, but you're very high, you're very elevated, you're very out of the way. It's an unforgiving landscape for people and wildlife in this situation. We've also done things, so this is South Branch. Top of the picture is going to be Navy Pier in the main branch. This is the South Branch after the reversal of the river, headed back south towards us. Normally, this river, like a lot of river systems, had this nice little meander. It has this jut out going east, curve back, and meandering rivers are going to create a lot of different kind of habitats just within their shape. They're going to be hitting certain walls of the river, certain edges more quickly. It's going to off. It's going to create kind of a pocket of slower current and it's bang around. The process is going to be creating unique environments like oxbow lakes and other things like this. You're going to get areas where there's a lot of flooding happening, so it's establishing floodplains and wetlands on either side of the river. And it's this normal, big, healthy system that lives and breathes and kind of inhales and exhales, and spring floods come and clean things out and help set things up for a successful summer with all these plant diversity. one of these things that we did first with this river system is we removed all of that. We cut straight through channel, straight down, facilitated barge and shipping traffic. But again, is one of those things that we just inherently did to tame and kind of strangle this river system, or unique environment. And a lot of this river system is just a big box moving water straight through the city as much as it can. This is the extensive work that was done to reverse the Chicago River. Normally, you've got the North Branch and then the South Branch, kind of a bubbly creek, meeting at the main branch and going out into the lake. After we went through the incredible steps of digging 2 miles out under Lake Michigan to pull in cleaner water, we still ended up polluting that entire distance. And so the reversal of the river was necessary, but certainly not a panacea, and certainly not anything that was going to improve the ecological situation. All this does now is send all this pollution further downstream into Illinois River. And then obviously all these kind of invasives that are now connected to a river system that they weren't before are going to be able to make their way down. So there's all these attempts to kind of block this. We see electric fish barriers to stop the Kopi or the Asian carp from coming through. There's a lot of other invasives, zebra and quagga mussels, which are pervasive throughout the lake system now, have made their way into the rivers, obviously. So there's a lot of continued anthropogenic challenges to this system. And it's just kind of re-hearkening how we've continued to do things that are making this an ecological restoration in this area very challenging. Continuing on this existing problems, trash, litter everywhere. It's bad when it's out in the highway. It's bad when it's out in a stream somewhere. It all concentrates and it all heads down to the city here. And this is where we've got our most people. Sometimes it's bigger things. We find car parts, we find old engines, we find refrigerators, anything that people didn't want to dispose of properly or maybe couldn't dispose of properly. They just threw it right into the river. Smaller bits, water bottles, all the food packaging that we put in, all going to end up in the river. Rivers are our lowest point in the landscape. So no matter what, all of this trash is eventually in one way or another going to end up back into the waterway or back into the river system. These plastics, as we are learning more and more, are also going to start to break down into smaller and smaller pieces. So even when there's a bulk removal of this kind of unnatural material, there still are all these smaller and much harder to remove pieces that portend really needing to have a more wide span and kind of expansive view of ways to keep this stuff out of here. We have a combined sewer system. So basically what that means is when we get a good amount of rain in the area at a given time, it can overwhelm our capacity for treating sewage. And then we have to mix rainwater and sewage and put it directly out into the lake. And this does not even include the surface runoff from all these river edge properties that are not going to go through that treatment system. So in the city of Chicago, Department of Water is going to clean the water and bring it to your house. The Metropolitan Water Reclamation District is going to deal with it after you're done with it. But all this stuff that exists throughout the city, all this water that doesn't go into that sewage system is going to go again to the lowest point in the landscape, which is going to be the river. So all these events, all these this miles and miles of RiverWalk that the city is building, one of the few things that is going to happen on every inch of this is they're going to be putting sidewalk, they're going to be doing salts all winter long. That's not going to go into the treatment system. And they're also going to be shedding artificial lighting via these walkway lights all year long, kind of almost regardless of the situation. So continued pollution from very local and specific sources are things that we have to deal with when working with this urban environment. Again, that combined sewer system, city, federal government has put a lot of money into this underground reservoir system. So it's at this point, I think 2 of the reservoirs, these are large former limestone quarries that have a lot of capacity for holding rainwater, stormwater. We have all the pipes in Chicago now, I believe, connected to at least 2 of these. So it really takes a lot of the burden off of the storm treatment system. However, we're still finding these combined sewer overflows are happening, and they, in a certain couple of very specific spots, are spitting out a lot of sewage at times. So this is all loaded with organic material. This organic material is going to get out into the environment. It's going to settle down. It's going to be digested by microbes. Those microbes are going to consume oxygen, and that is going to create anoxic zones within this river system. It's going to lead to a lot of really nasty, mucky bottom sediment that is really difficult to remove, if even possible in the first place. You also just have knuckleheads. There's just a lot of bozos around that look at, this is Wolf Point. A couple years ago, one of the Chicago water taxi patrons took this picture. This is a subcontractor pumping this groundwater from this construction site straight into the river. This is emblematic of how people feel about this river still. If you don't know too much about all this work that's been put into it, and all you see is the trash, and all you see is a lack of anything that you would connect with being like lively and healthy, you think, why not? This is just everyone's open toilet, so why not pump this dirty kind of really sedimenty water into the river? To them, and that's a kind of perception that I think really continues to harm the health of the river, especially when you're at a spot in the river where there's 2 million people alongside. There's a lot of people around here. Even a handful of people's opinions about the dirtiness of the river can contribute to them wasting more and putting more litter in there and kind of exacerbating the problem. Flooding is a regular thing in the Chicago River system. This whole system is controlled by 2 points at the Navy Pier up in Wilmette, where there's a pumping station. When the Army Corps, the MWRD, decide that big weather is coming through, they're going to draw the level of the river down and let that rainwater back up. And a couple times this year and a couple times in the past, they will raise that and they'll try to move as much water through as is possible. In extreme cases, the river has actually had to been re-reversed to go back out into Lake Michigan. Normally, basically how they reverse the river is by making sure that Lake Michigan is always higher than Chicago River, so gravity is going to carry the lake into the river. In this situation, the river was higher than the lake, and so they had to open those locks and let that come out into the lake. Not a good situation, and not something that you really want to be doing for more than a couple hours at a time in an emergency. This is a picture of the Whole Foods River Walk right by where our project is. And this is showing just basically how maximum extent of this water. Ducks are swimming around on the Riverwalk here. And not only that, you can sort of see it, but the bottom of the sidewalk here, there was a layer of this kind of just sediment, all this stuff that's kind of really mucky and muddy right there. Sediment was laid over there. As these floodwaters receded, I could see little trails of little minnows that have been kind of tracing in these little shapes in the bottom of this. So this river system has, and a lot of urban river systems have, a need to flow up and down. Anything that you do has to be able to exist, understanding that. It's a big challenge for engineering when it comes to reworking a lot of these river edge sites, especially in very urban environments. So what can we do? These are all the things, these are the challenges, these are all the reasons why working in urban environments is especially hard and doesn't really get done a whole lot. Not only that, if you think about the limited resources, I've got $1 million to put in somewhere into something that's going to boost ecology, ecosystems, going to boost some natural area. I can spend a lot of that improving a forest preserve, removing buckthorn, doing all these things that are tried and true and we know work. But on the flip side, there's not a whole lot of people that can always get out to forest preserves. You really limit the amount of people that can experience this stuff when you only do it in places where nature's already been relatively protected. It's already relatively pristine. So again, our strategy here is to take some of these resources and extend these concepts into the city and do it in a way that makes sense within the urban environment. So our project site here, our main project is going to be, as I mentioned, the Wild Mile, about North Avenue, which is the north tip of Goose Island there, down to Halstead or Chicago-ish Avenue, south tip of Goose Island there. That east side, that's the Ogden Canal. So first mayor of Chicago, Ogden, he owned a lot of land all around Goose Island. He wanted to make that land more valuable. He also had a brick making factory, so he needed clay. Kill two birds with one stone here. Dig out this canal. The canal was probably dug to about, I think, 15 or 18 feet deep eventually. Alongside, you've got a lot of moving grain, moving logs. Goose Island was a big train depot, so rail connection onto the island. That's facilitating a lot of logistics and a lot of supportive industry that used to line these sections of the river. Nowadays, we've just got a lot of space to work with. And the question becomes, what do we start to do with these spaces? Industry's not able to use these anymore, even if they wanted to. I mentioned it was dug to 18 feet, where we are talking about, close to 10 feet of really fine organic sediment muck that is built up over these years. Stuff that's laden with heavy metals, stuff that's laden with VOCs and PA. I'm trying to think of all these acronyms and make sure they're right. But all this nasty stuff that we've accumulated as a city over the years, sitting there on the bottom. So a couple of things that we need to do are figure out, how do we deal with this flooding? How do we make sure we're not resuspending these pollutants, making them available to the environment, to the ecosystem again? And how do we fit into the urban context, understanding that people are not going to tear down their towers to give the river a little more space to do what it needs to do. So solution here, co-founder Josh Yellen with his little pet island, taking it for a walk. He's one of the co-founders. And this picture was from an experiment that we did, Josh and I. Josh was working on his master's capstone at University of Illinois. Just looking at this little pilot island and seeing, are fish more interested in hanging out near this thing than near a dock or than near seawall or some other kind of artificial unvegetated structure? So there were a lot of problems with this island. As you can see, it's very, very small. It's going to be really hard to draw any kind of conclusions. If you'll notice, it's incredibly low to the water. Any amount of wave action was going to wash right over that. So we had to do things to kind of increase the buoyancy. And there are a lot of hungry geese around that made sure that was never going to stay planted for long. So we had to erect some bird fencing and other things like that. But eventually, when we worked out all the kinks and did this research, just simple fish trap deployment beneath the islands and a couple other sample or null value areas, can try to hopefully determine if there's something to this kind of structure. Fish are interested in anything. You shove your hand down into the water, you shove a camera down into the water, they're going to swim up and see what's going on. But the next step is, are they coming there for a specific reason? Is there something you're providing them nesting wise? Or is there something you're providing them shelter wise? Are you giving them a place for escaping from predators? This kind of stuff. We don't just necessarily want to know, are they there? Are they utilizing this for something? So this research, it started off very promising, very well. Yeah, fish are more interested than the planet island than they are the dirty, stinky seawall or just a flat dock. Pretty important to get us going, but still a lot more that needed to be answered and still does, to be honest. Again, Goose Island Canal here. So this is our blank canvas. This is the stretch of river that we had available to us that no other property owners were going to do anything with. Army Corps had said that they don't really have any money or plans to dredge anywhere in here. The Cherry Avenue Bridge, which was that rail connection onto Goose Island, was locked into place. So now the Army Corps can't even get dredging material down into the canal here. So this truly is just kind of our spot to be able to play around and experiment with these different types of habitat restoration. The seawall, the steel vertical seawall, one of the greatest challenges. It's going to give you your best protection from a shoreline stabilization point of view, but it's also going to create the biggest disconnect between aquatic and terrestrial based ecosystems. This is the most important point of a river, right? Is moving from land into water and having a smooth connection point. And this is one of the first things and the most significant things that we do to make sure that we don't allow these connections to happen. So I think just looking at it, it's like, hey, what if we can just green this up a bit? And this is kind of what we landed on, is these floating islands, these artificial floating wetlands. All the plants here are growing hydroponically out of the river water. They're basically established on, it's going to be HDPE pontoons, so kind of a pontoon structure, and then inside are flexible planting rows or different methods of basically just holding plants into place, letting their roots grow out and kind of fill in all this space, and then letting the plant itself be the structure by which all this other stuff can begin to happen. This is our 2017 island. So this is looking north. This was our very first set of islands. This is before the city got involved. This is before we had much support from almost anybody. We're just a grassroots nonprofit. We had a Kickstarter that got us $70,000, and we got an Army Corps permit and a couple other permits in place after many years of working. And this is what we put in. And this was supposed to be a demonstration of this stuff working. And one of the things that we were dismayed by going into this process is the number of cities that were telling us that they had tried this already, the number of groups that had said they looked into this and they don't work. And it just kind of seemed like it can't be true, that just to ensure these succeeded. So we not only wanted to work with the right type of manufacturer, so these are all manufactured in Scotland from Biomatrix water over there. And we get them from Scotland because that initial island, that pilot island, we had gotten from a domestic producer, had all these issues with it, and was kind of a microplastics nightmare. We switched over to a supplier that has reduced to the least amount of plastic perhaps possible, given the engineering and kind of structural integrity needs, providing the most amount of space and most amount of flexible planting area for these plants to go in. So this is just after installing in July of 2017. And then a year later, that is the result. So a lot of hibiscus mosquitoes, so rose mallow. We did a lot of Decadon verticalis, which is swamp loosestrife, native loosestrife on kind of that left edge of the screen there. And then there's a ton of other stuff that just kind of hopped on. We got a lot of jewel weed on there. There's Joe Pie weed, which we had planted. We'll try to look at some of the other stuff. Swamp milkweed. There's a lot of good stuff on there. This initial island, we were trying out a bunch of things. So we did about 50 or 55 different species, even trying out some of the crappy little crop plants we got from Home Depot, just to see what food would do. And then we took that food over to get tested for heavy metals. And of course, as you'd expect, heavy metals are detected in anything leafy green wise. That's just kind of par for the course when it comes to disturbed environments and polluted environments. But I was happy about it because it just let us put some more native plants in their place. So good first step, 2017. We really wanted to lean into this and make this a bigger and bigger project. The thing that you can kind of gather from where we're standing here is you're still really separated. Like we talked in that first part, the separation is still an enormous problem for people and wildlife. And even though there's this really cool project that we were really excited about, had a good first showing, has a lot of kind of energy around it, it's still really difficult for anybody to be able to get up and see this and kind of interact with this. So the next step is to take that concept and build it out into an eco park. Now that is something obviously we just made up basically. What is an eco park? Essentially the concept, as we've mentioned before, This is a park that is not built for humans first. This is a park that's built for wildlife first. The things that we do out here, we're trying to enhance ecology, ecological connection, and functioning with anything that we do. But we also realize that we're in a city. We want to bring people down to come see this. Not everyone's going to be able to get to a national park. Some people barely can get more than a couple of blocks without needing some kind of expensive transportation measure. So this is about bringing wildlife to people in an area that are really kind of starved for it. And then, of course, ignore those numbers. They mean nothing. 2018, so long ago, aspirational. So here's our first iteration of the Wild Mile. It's our, I guess what you call phase one. We put this floating walkway system in 2021. And then the gardens had been in since 2020. After the walkway was put in, we moved them over. Again, all floating, pretty important for a lot of these city-based projects. So this walkway is what these gardens are now attached to. Very simple and easy to kind of get out on them, do this maintenance, look as these plants are flowering throughout the years, do plant phenology work, weeding, removing trash, counting the pollinators and different things that come and visit and utilize these things. And then, as you can see, people can get right up to this stuff. It's a different environment down on the river, especially in the city. That hustle and bustle, that noise, those screeching tires and things crashing and metal, all this gets kind of blocked out when you get down in there, which I think is one of the reasons that wildlife likes it so much inherently. But also, as people are being able to explore this space more and more, you just see people turn into kids, and you see the excitement, and you see running back and forth and being so instantly connected with something that they really didn't have a chance to very easily before. So we're very proud of this. But again, it's the first step, and this is a big old river system. So as we kind of learn more and more and build more and more, we're expecting things to change and things to, we just got to go with the flow and learn from some of our mistakes. The engagement piece, again, pretty big. We've had big Wild Mile block parties, so getting the whole neighborhood down to enjoy. We've got a heavy volunteer component, so a lot of folks from all around will come in. They'll grab kayaks from us. They'll pick up trash. They'll look at bugs, so aquatic macroinvertebrate studies that we're doing. They'll help us with that. All kinds of data gathering, all kind of maintenance activities. It's all stuff that's really important for us that it gets done. Again, when we're talking about artificial wetland systems that may have failed, it's probably because a city spent $50,000 on it and shoved it out in the middle of a lake and didn't tell anybody why it was there or what it was doing, and they didn't maintain it at all. So of course it failed. With this kind of strategy, lean a lot more into being publicly involved and bringing the community in on this process rather than just saying, here's a park, enjoy it, and if you don't, I don't really care. This is a park that is for people, that is supposed to be taking in all people's suggestions, understanding the uses that neighbors would like to see, and then expanding this concept not only throughout our canal here, but throughout the wider river system, which is probably how you start to get to see those higher level results that you'd really hope to see ecosystem wise. You can walk on these. That's a big question that we've got. These kind of pictures help describe and show a little bit of the installation process. So again, we're just kind of bolting them together into these shapes. We're floating them down. We're anchoring them on in a couple of different ways. Some are anchored to the seawall, where we'll weld something onto the seawall and then have a cable connected to a weight. And then the islands are just clipped onto that. And so they'll move up and down as far as the seawall goes, basically. Or in the case of the walkway in a lot of those gardens, we have big concrete blocks that are sitting at the bottom that are connected to chains and kind of this elastic rubber band system, basically. So the chains are there in case all hell breaks loose, just making sure they're going to stay in the same place roughly. The bands will actually let these flooding gardens flex up and down with the level of the river. And that July 4th, that big flooding event where we had the river go back out into the lake for a little bit, if you can see this seawall in the background, the river was up to the top of that seawall. So all of this stuff that we built had to come with it. And obviously I'm smiling and here, so that all worked well and we didn't have any kind of problems. You don't really want stress tests necessarily, but when you pass them, you feel pretty good about it. We've got different types of modules on here. So our manufacturer works with us a lot. When we kind of come up with a crazy idea, he tries to develop something that is going to help us do that, help us execute that. So we asked him for a tree bowl. He gave us a tree bowl, a tree platform. This is a pawpaw. We planted it when it was this size. It has gotten eaten by beavers 3 different times now. I finally got the fencing up in a way that protects it, and this pawpaw is now 5 or 6 feet tall. So plants love it, trees love it. Again, some context of that urban environment means you've got to treat it a little differently than you would elsewhere. But things, you give them a chance, and they're going to be able to do what they want to do. We've got a couple of different, so Greater Angelica on the right there. It's kind of a native carrot, I think. Really cool, tall, early season species, gets up, has these really bizarre kind of flowering. You don't see this a whole lot, even in kind of forest preserves and things like this, even around here. It's a species that just likes its really specific environment. And in some cases, we're able to provide that just with these platforms. Monarch butterflies are the kind of the poster child of sort of the pollinators. We get plenty of those. We plant a lot of milkweed and a lot of Joe Pye weed that are attracting these things year long. We've had in recent years ruby-throated hummingbirds coming by. Lots of different pollinator interests, lots of different bird interest, really, really cool things. I mean, it makes a lot of sense though, right? Plants are the foundations of any ecosystem. They're the ones doing the hard work of turning sunlight into energy and food. So obviously you got to start there when you're trying to rebuild habitat and ecosystem from nothing. We also working with DuPage County Forest Preserve. They got an urban stream research center out there. Really nice place, really cool place to go on for a field trip or a visit or something. We bring them, we go elsewhere in the North Branch of the Chicago River. We bring them gravid female mussels, pregnant female mussels. They extract their little babies and they rear us for them in lab there and then return them to us. A year ago, we gave them 3 gravid females and they gave us back 1,500 juveniles probably 9 months later. So we don't have to rob from nice, natural, healthy populations. This is all Pyganodon grandis. Kind of this shortcut in life cycle to help us get a lot more return and get a lot more of these mussels populated back quickly in the wild mile, especially. We have other kinds of platforms on the left here. It's got that rigid pontoon structure, but instead of planting rows in the middle, it's got a hanging basket. And in the hanging basket, we can put different types of substrates. We can put gravel, rocks, twigs, leaf packs, anything we want in there. Makes a really flexible spot to be able to kind of recreate sort of a different bottom, sort of a different benthic environment. On the top there, you can see just enough current is blocked to develop all this duckweed growth. So lemna minor, great opportunity to add an important food source that is also shading the water, that is also adding oxygen to the water. So again, trying to support all parts of these ecosystems. On the right, we have some Sagittaria. So this is a native emergent species that we found growing under like 2 feet of water. It doesn't make sense at all why it's growing here. No, I've never seen it grow this deep. It's kind of crazy. But again, you give life chance. It does what it needs to do. It finds a way. Root systems dangling down. This is some of the mesocosm tubs that we had at the Botanic Garden, just trying to play around with stuff in a more controlled setting. You'll see kind of the 2 middle species there are going to be Carex lacustris, so lake sedge, and then Juncus effusus, river rush. So those are going to have rather deeper, denser root systems. Calamagrostis canadensis on the far left with finer roots, Asclepias incarnata on the right there with finer roots as well. So depending on the plants you're choosing and the strategy for whatever you're looking at in this particular section, you might pick some plants over others. These look better when I put them on the slideshow. They look terrible now, but on the left here, this is more underwater shots of these root structures, big tap roots that kind of spiral down and create big thick chunks, but then also some of these finer root hairs that are sort of extending out. That's all good surface area for algae and microbes to grow on. That's going to provide a lot of surface area. Fish lay their eggs. In the submerged basket, which is the picture on the right, we stuck a camera down there, and separated by our mussel bunkers or by our baskets of sand, there were two distinct pumpkin seed that were guarding their little nests that they had just fanned out right then and there, which we've got on our YouTube channel. All this stuff is in much better quality on our YouTube channel if you're interested in checking that out. So again, this area of the river, urbanized waterways, stuff, you put anything in there, they're going to like it. You put something that's built for them, hope is they're going to like it even more. Aquatic macroinvertebrate surveys. This is something that the Illinois RiverWatch has been phenomenally helpful with, as you can imagine. Our entire operation here uses these RiverWatch materials that allow us to bring in volunteers to really figure out, are we doing every piece of this ecosystem? Are we touching all of the different types of organisms? We don't just want to make plants. We also want to ensure that all these key indicators of aquatic health are following along with our plans. Otherwise, we're probably missing something. So full gamut of stuff, a lot of quagga mussels, especially. I see less zebras, more quaggas, but a lot of cool stuff. Chronomids, planorbid snails, midges, damselfly, all this good stuff that you'd really want to see. Ton of scuds, unbelievable number of scuds. All these things that you probably maybe want to see, but weren't really sure we're down there, because this kind of work is not done in urban environments all that much, because it's kind of depressing, unless you've got some real good reason or hunch that it might be doing better all of a sudden. Some of the work that we've been doing, on the left there, we've got our water chemistry improvements that we documented with Illinois State. That was starting in 2018, just those initial sets of islands, just taking simple water sample, vertical water sampler, upstream, midstream, and downstream at 1 foot down and at the surface, kind of detailing nitrogen and phosphorus, nitrate and phosphate being uptaken reliably, 5 to 7% in the summer. But then even going into the winter, nitrates being uptaken or at least removed, denitrification happening at about 5% going from upstream to downstream, suggesting that it isn't just the plants and the plant growth. Something else is microbially going on there, perhaps, or some other method of denitrification. As we compared our site to other sites, we're also looking at, hey, directly, how much phosphorus concentration is pulled up by these different types of plants, finding that, okay, sedges and rushes, they're going to be pulling up proportionally less, but they've got a lot more biomass. The flowers pulling up proportionally more, much less biomass. Interesting things, all confirming that phosphorus uptake at a reliable rate, but not necessarily honing in on anything specific, giving us a lot of good directions to go in the future. Different aspects of fish monitoring. The shed aquarium has been really helpful with this, as has the MWRD. Just looking at differences between our locations, our floating wetland sites, and areas that don't have anything near that. So in some cases, we see total fish kind of within that margin of error, within that within the error bars, roughly the same, but then you actually see statistically less carp near our floating wetlands, statistically more shiners near our floating wetlands. Who knows why that might be? That could just be a consequence of being a very small project in a very large river system. But as the shed and as the MWRD does more exploration into this, we're finding that tagged acoustic fish are actually moving a whole lot. They do not just stick in the same place. In some cases, they're moving dozens of river miles north or south, and even just within a week or two. They're escaping areas where it probably is less comfortable, perhaps moving to areas where it's more comfortable. So it kind of suggests that these little pockets of habitat, these little havens, might be useful for fish that are much more transitory that you might imagine, especially in this river system. And then, like I mentioned, so Wild Mile's our main focus area. That's our flagship project. But we're also starting to get funds to do this work elsewhere. These are some of the gardens that we have down at Bubbly Creek on the South Branch. So another notoriously polluted old canal. That's the natural east fork of the South Branch of the Chicago River. Now has a big, nasty combined sewer overflow point at the end. So one of those places where it's going to spit out a lot of organic material. It's going to have those really anoxic events, a lot of nutrients. This is the point where, hey, these plants in stream probably can do a lot of work and a lot of good, even in these kind of rather extreme events. We've also got federal funds to start working down at River Park, or sorry, up at River Park, kind of where the North Branch meets the North Shore Channel. Again, another really critical part of the river where there should be a lot of connectivity and a lot of ecological activity, but because of the urban environment, there's just not so much. So yeah, this is my whole spiel here. This is the beauty of these things. Being able to do these things into the river has been the biggest impediment. There's a lot of situations along river edges where there's a lot of good work. Chicago has a RiverWalk ordinance, meaning that river edge up to 30 feet is going to be pretty well protected throughout the city. But the lack of creativity leaves a lot to be desired. You can kind of see in this picture alone, you look across and there's the traditional kind of soil erosion tactics. You're trying to put coconut coir rolls. You're trying to stabilize the edge somewhat using just seed and kind of tossing it out there. Unfortunately, that's just not going to cut it in a lot of these river edge environments. You need to be doing what more they're doing on this side. We're standing in the foreground here. Is a really well, it's a kind of armored riprap at the bottom, has that gentle slope, but continues up into really nice native planting areas at Canal Origins Park. So there's some combination of this out there that works and makes sense in an urban environment. We not only want to do these things for these ecosystem purposes, but we also want to make sure that people can get here, they can see this, they see the flowers, they see the buzz, the activity, the noise, the birds, the fish. They see all that and they kind of understand, oh, this is not a beaten and disgusting thing. It's actually something that's on the up and up. And we have, we spend all this billions of dollars and years re-reversing the river and digging out into the lake to get clean water. We spend all this money doing all this stuff that separates these things. What if we put that much effort into reconnecting these things? So that's our organization, that's our mission, that's these projects. Thank you guys so much for letting us share more about this, and anybody at all who's interested in doing some of this crazy stuff, helping us out, just coming and visiting, we'll give you the tour. We'll tell you all about our harebrained schemes to do more and more, but just really want to get more people out to enjoy this kind of stuff so that we have more of a reason to go out and do more of it. So thank you all so much. I'll take any questions you guys have.
All right, thanks, Phil. That was great. I love hearing about your work at Urban Rivers. It's so interesting. There are a couple of questions in the chat, so I'm going to start by reading those off. Pat asks, what is the content of the island, or what is it made of, and the anticipated lifespan?
Yeah, so the structure, and I might be able to get back to a better picture. So the structure is going to be this, that's all right. So it's kind of this, it's a frame, it's a rectangular frame that is basically HDPE, so plastic pontoons. And those plastic pontoons are connected to metal phalanges, so stainless steel metal pieces, and those slot in, and then we bolt straight through that. So the connection, the frame of the whole thing is these big rectangles, these pontoon rectangles that's going to give the buoyancy, that's going to make sure everything stays in place. And then the middle, it depends on what kind of island you're working on. In this case, what we're looking at here, flexible planning rows that's coconut coir kind of wrapped in HDPE mesh. But the concept is that that coconut coir strips away really quickly, and all that should be left after a while is that plant material, and then the remaining plastic mesh. That's HDPE, so that's probably going to be that, or the stainless steel connection pieces are probably going to be the limiting factor in lifespan. Our not even close. So we would probably guess it's a good, based on our experience with it, maybe 15 or so before you really have to do some kind of serious maintenance on it. But again, what that means and what that entails, not exactly clear. The concept is that eventually these root systems are what are holding on to each other and providing most of the mass of these things. So the concept definitely needs more life in order to be able to answer those questions. Yeah, that the 25 years I don't think is unrealistic.
And then she also asked, have any non-native plants come along to spoil your project?
Yeah. Yes. We haven't had, it's honestly some of the worst ones are the native invasives. So that jewelweed, I say worse relative to our maintenance requirements. Jewelweed or bugleweed or what's the other, willow herb, those really pop up, and we just need to get to them at the right time of year. Jewelweed will come up and gets really tall really early in the year, so that can kind of create problems. Bugleweed, as things are starting to grow up and get taller, are going to be tackling things and kind of wiggling along the ground. So there's a point where we have to hit that. And then the willow herb can get really deep, big, and dense at kind of later in the year. So those are kind of the most, they're not even annoying, but they can really hurt the diversity if you're not going to stay on top of them. Now, what that looks like for us is basically having, we're probably talking about 5 hours of work in a week, maybe 20 hours a month or something. And all these are what we've got out there, pretty spick and span. Siberian elms, we've got a lot of those in the area. Those are hopping on all over the place. Phalaris, so the reed canary grass, I've seen pop up in a couple of places, but we've been able to deal with that just with a small amount of herbicide as you can get away with. But yeah, ultimately, luckily, it's mostly aggressive natives that we have the problem with. Any other invasive that you would expect from an urban environment is present there. It's just they don't really have a lot of those invasives, those non-native invasives, are very comfortable on land and not so comfortable in water. So once we kind of get that diversity of natives established, it's really dense. By the time it hits July, it's really, really hard to establish anything that isn't something that we planted in here. So luckily with a couple of well-timed maintenance days at a couple times a year, you can really accomplish a lot of what you want and protect a lot of that plant diversity.
Okay, and then Danielle asks, since heavy metals were found in the crop plants, I assume they're also in the native plants, how might this impact the wildlife that is being attracted to the Wild Mile?
Yeah, so it was interesting too, because when we did that water chemistry testing, we were also looking for heavy metals, but every time we were testing, the graduate student that was doing the heavy metal part of that was not finding any detectable heavy metals in the water. And this is what we find in a lot of when MWRD, when the Water Reclamation District samples, they also find very low levels, if below detectable threshold, of these heavy metals. But we know very well the types and the amounts and the concentration that exist from benthic samples, from core samples. So what I think ultimately happens is on a clear sunny day when we would generally be doing these water samplings, there would be no churn of this water column of this, but when storms come through, when big boats come by, when anything, they can come by and they could kick that stuff up and they could potentially make that bioavailable to these plants. In terms of how it impacts the natives, I think the biggest thing that we have to watch out for is there tends to be, from what I've read, an accumulation of some of these heavy metals in the root systems that can inhibit their uptake of certain magnesium or kind of other fertilizers. When we're going early in the year, a lot of our plants, a lot of our natives, as they're growing up, look kind of chlorotic. Their leaves look yellow. They don't look as healthy as they can be. And it probably doesn't get straightened. It's probably about May to June or so where that happens. And that might be because these kind of heavy metals are inhibiting some uptake. It also might be that it's early in the year and all of these plants hungry for fertilizer right then. So maybe they're pulling relatively lower concentrations of fertilizer out of the water than they need to. But it's something that kind of corrects itself over time. But there's also, there's plants out there that we put in. We started off with that 50 or 55 native species, and it's winnowed down to about 25 now. Those 20 or 25 do very well and come back consistently. But it might be that they were too sensitive to that very same pollution that we're talking about, and couldn't hack it. So that's something that as we kind of gain more resources and more availability to look at the fate of these heavy metals and kind of other pollutants like that in these tissues and in these things, that becomes more, that's a future direction for our research for sure.
Great. Okay. And then she also asked, do you do any winter maintenance / vegetation removal, or is the organic matter allowed to build up over time?
Yeah, we really want to build, we absolutely keep everything on basically as it is until March or so. And then March, when we're really interested in getting the light exposure, more like April, really. We're really interested in getting the light exposure down to the new plant growth. So just kind of in any other situation where you might clip some of that and kind of open up a lot of space for stuff to hop in. And then especially in the winter or going into the spring, keeping the geese off becomes extremely important. Any area that they sit down and nest in, they're going to crush the natives that were there, and they are going to encourage the spread of the aggressive stuff in that patch that they crushed, because there's a bunch of free space. So the winter maintenance is pretty dang low, minus making sure that the anchoring systems are all well connected. We don't get a whole lot of ice by us. Ice flows are kind of the biggest concern. That's going to be like a boat hitting it if it hits it the right way. But we're just in a situation where we don't really get any kind of ice like that. So luckily our winter maintenance is very, very low.
Okay, thank you. Does anybody else have any more questions for Phil? You're welcome to put it in the chat or unmute yourself. Okay, so, how do you keep the geese away?
Oh, I just get out there with a broom and I just sort of just, we've got bird fencing that we build. We like ducks on there. We don't mind muskrats on there. Beavers hop on there all the time. So we kind of create little doors, but otherwise it's kind of like, maybe 2 foot tall fencing, regular gauge, not thicker than chicken wire, but not like a chain link fence necessarily. So that fencing goes up and we have it around. Once the plants get established in July, once they're tall enough, the geese aren't interested in it anyway. So it's really about protecting them in the most vulnerable point, that about April to end of June.
Well, thank you for your presentation, and thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. Before you go, I just want to mention that our next Fall Speaker Series event will be Thursday, October 12th. And this will be Natalie Hernandez from St. Louis University, and slightly relevant because Phil mentioned this in his presentation. She'll be talking about microplastics, specifically her research on microplastics in the St. Louis watersheds. And then also, as we are approaching the winter season, we have several chloride monitoring training workshops coming up in October and November. These workshops are 1 hour long virtual presentations that will teach you about the hazards of road salt and how to monitor chloride in our streams as part of the Winter Chloride Watchers program. So I hope to see some of you at our future events. But thank you again, Phil, for the presentation, and thank you everybody for coming.